Bryan Kohberger, the psychopath in prison. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You'll recall that in the early morning of November the 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were fatally stabbed in an off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. The next month, Bryan Kohberger was arrested on 4 accounts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty. On July the 2nd, 2025, Kohberger entered a guilty plea to all charges against him as part of a deal to avoid the death penalty. On July 23rd, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary. I've analysed separately what Kohberger is, and if you haven't watched that already, I'd encourage you to do so. I've also explained the impact of the emotional impact statements that were given, particularly that by the sister of Kaylee Gonzalez, and how that would be perceived by Kohberger by virtue of the fact that I made the determination that he's a psychopath with narcissistic traits. Again, if you haven't accessed that already, I'd encourage you to do so, because not only is it likely to surprise you with regard to his reaction, but to provide you with particular insight into the way that the psychopath behaves. I've previously provided videos about the narcissist being in jail. Again, I'd encourage you to watch those videos to understand more about the impact of prison on a narcissist. But what about the psychopath? Well, first of all, let us have some consideration for the circumstances that he'll find himself in. A report written by Germania Rodriguez Polillo tells us that Bryan Kohberger's 1 hour of daily recreation in prison will be spent in a chain-link cage littered with feces and soaked in urine, according to inmate complaints. The quadruple killer was transferred to J Block, the notoriously restrictive long-term housing for inmates in protective custody or on death row at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution last week. Kohberger is being held in a single-person cell. He will be moved around wearing restraints and only allowed to shower every other day. According to the Idaho Department of Corrections, he will also be given 60 minutes of outdoor recreation a day. The Idaho Maximum Security Institution has previously been accused of inhumane treatment by those in solitary confinement. Inmates in isolation have said they are kept in cages during recreational time, which they described as large chain link-like metal boxes each man is placed into, littered with human urine and feces that have soaked into the concrete. In 2024, dozens organised a 6-day hunger strike, claiming delays in access to medical care and horrific living conditions, as reported by the Idaho Statesman. They said that the HVAC system had not been cleaned in decades and was clogged with garbage and human excrement. The Idaho Department of Correction stated that the cages were recreation enclosures and regularly cleaned. Inmates could also ask for the vents in their cells to be cleaned. Kohberger will enjoy various privileges, including access to a television, an electronic tablet with music, and emails, potentially affording him the opportunity to communicate with morbid fans. To keep a tablet in his cell, Kohberger will have to pay $100. A TV will also cost him $100 and provide access to cable programming. Accordingly, this is the environment into which he has been placed. In effect, solitary confinement with only 1 hour of recreational activity in a situation which is described as particularly unpleasant. But he does have access to a tablet with music, emails, and also a television. So how will this impact upon him as a psychopath? Well, first of all, he's not a narcissist, although he has narcissistic traits. He enjoys attention, something I explained in my analysis of him, but he doesn't have a pathological need for fuel. And therefore, the isolation that he experiences and the minimal involvement with people, whereby the only people that he will probably interact with will be staff, be they prison officers or support staff, is going to be minimal. And that will provide him with some social discourse, albeit of a minimal nature. But it's not a case that it's going to provide a problem for him vis-a-vis fuel, because he doesn't need it. He also, of course, has the ability to communicate with people via email. Therefore, that provides an outlet for him. Fuel isn't the consideration for him. Remember, as a psychopath, he is driven by his psychopathic traits to pursue three things: control, stimulation, and accumulation. The fact that he is locked up amounts to a significant threat to his control, because he no longer enjoys the liberty that he once did. This will be problematic for him. Nevertheless, over time, he will get used to it, both in terms of the fact that he's in prison and that he's placed into a solitary environment. The fact that he is told where he has to be and what he must do similarly affects his need for control. However, he will become used to his environment, and his need for control will then be shaped within that particular environment. It will not be the case that each and every day he will be trying to rail against it, but rather his circumstances will adapt. It's also the fact that his psychopathy will cause him to focus on the outlets that he has, namely access to the tablet, television, and emails, to offset the overall threat to his need for control. Whilst it will not be pleasant for him being in these cages, which apparently are soaked in urine and feces, the fact is that he doesn't experience anxiety or fear, and he will simply shrug it off. Stimulation is the major problem that he would face as a consequence of, one, being in prison, and two, being in solitary confinement. And that would pose a particular problem for the psychopath, given the low boredom threshold and that innate need for stimulation. However, given the fact that there is some interaction with staff, unlikely to be any interaction with other prisoners, but, and here's the major part, because he's able to watch television, because he is able to access a tablet, which presumably allows him to read books on that tablet and listen to music, and because he has access to emails, he does have outlets which will afford him a degree of stimulation. It will not be as great as it had been on the outside, and it will be problematic for him. But it's nowhere near as problematic as if he was lying on a bed staring at a grey wall with nothing to do. He does have the ability to seek that stimulation. In terms of accumulation, he may well turn to seeking to accumulate other things dependent upon the extent of the privileges that is allowed. For instance, the accumulation of material that is sent to him, food, perhaps hygiene products, such like. Whether that's allowed or not, it's unclear. He may seek to accumulate friendships by seeking to strike up a rapport with staff, although he will be limited in that regard. Ordinarily, he would look to accumulate other prisoners, but it would appear that he's being kept apart from them, mainly for his own safety, and therefore that is going to be denied to him. What he will experience, however, is a general discontent, not at a horrendous level, because he will get used to the threats to the issue of control, and he does have some outlets with regard to stimulation, but they are nowhere near the level that is needed for him. And therefore, it will be necessary for him to try and, in effect, generate his own entertainment, which would result in, for instance, in either trying to goad or provoke guards with potential consequences that arise from that, If he's able to deal with staff and goad them and provoke them in a similar way in order to deal with the issue of control, to strike back against them, he will find that the requirement for stimulation will continue to impact upon him, driving him to try and create some form of reaction, not for fuel, but because he needs that stimulation. And I should imagine that he will engage in copious emailing, both in the writing of the same and the receipt of such information, so that that can maintain that stimulation. I do not doubt that he will formulate online email relationships. As you are aware, it is often the case that certain individuals find themselves being fated by women who are interested in them, who have some deep-seated desire to communicate with a murderer, a psychopathic murderer, and in such circumstances, I do not doubt that the major area of stimulation that will come for him is through his ability to send emails and develop online relationships, presumably with a number of women. Undoubtedly, his emails will be monitored in both directions, but that's not going to stop him being able to seek to manipulate those individuals for the purposes of seeking that stimulation and to receive stimulation by way of what they send to him in terms of writing and possibly if they're able to send pictures, etc. This is going to be a particularly significant outlet for him. Naturally, being incarcerated is a problem for him because he cannot attain the necessary triad in the way that he would do when he was in the outside world. But it's not going to be the horrendous experience that one would necessarily believe it to be as a consequence of the fact that he will shift in order to deal with threats to control, and he does have outlets that will afford the stimulation that he seeks. There will, however, be under the surface that repeated desire to stir things up, to seek an outlet, to cause some kind of trouble, those impulsive inclinations that will result in him trying to do something to alleviate the repeated need for control and stimulation and accumulation. The conditions themselves will seem unpleasant. He will be less affected by that than a normal person would as a consequence of his psychopathy. He may utilize those conditions, of course, to bring about complaint for the purposes of dealing with issues of control and to seek stimulation. It's certainly nowhere near the situation that he has once hitherto enjoyed. But out of many people that would be placed within the prison population, his psychopathy is going to allow him to cope with it to a better degree than most, particularly because he has the outlets of a television, a tablet, and an email set up, which is going to provide him with the stimulation. Were those taken away, then that would pose particular problems for him with regard to the issue of stimulation, likely meaning that he would behave far more impulsive, with a greater degree of impulsivity and chaotic behaviour, which would naturally translate into being a problematic prisoner vis-a-vis his interactions with the staff. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.